Airbrushing can be intimidating, and though I have been doing it for years and have made several videos on the topic, there are still new ways that airbrushes can surprise me. So today, let's talk about how you can avoid this, as well as some other beginner and advanced tips and tricks that I wish I didn't have to learn the hard way. But before we begin, what has been your greatest airbrush fail? Don't pull the needle out the back. Previously, I recommended to clean your airbrush by unscrewing the nut on the back, pouring airbrush cleaner into the cup, then scrubbing the needle with a brush while slowly pulling the needle back through the gun. Unfortunately, that technique can lead to you pulling paint through your gun, the exact thing you want to avoid. Which, to be fair, is how I was taught to clean an airbrush, so that's how I taught you to clean an airbrush. Instead, you want to loosen the front nozzle, loosen the needle nut on the back, and then push the needle out the front of your gun. This prevents you from dragging paint through your gun, and since you're probably removing the nozzle to clean it anyway, it's just fewer steps overall and reduces the likelihood of accidentally bending your needle while putting it back in through the back of the gun. Just remember that the nozzle should come off with very little pressure. Not only was I taught to pull the needle out the back, on my first airbrush, I also couldn't get the nozzle off just by pushing on the needle. So if you have to force the nozzle off by pushing hard on the needle to pop it off the gun, don't do that. Don't do it that way. Just accept that you have to pull it out the back and clean the gun every time. This is also important when you are trying to back blow air into your gun. Do not pull the needle back into your gun. You can just clamp it with your fingers very delicately, and that should be enough to block the air to help you mix whatever you need in your cup. Don't move your airbrush in aggressive circles, which, again, is how I was taught to paint. If you need to move your airbrush in aggressive circles to prevent the paint from splattering, that means that your PSI is too high or you are too close to your surface. If you ever see me going wild in an airbrushing video, that's because it's just a force of habit after airbrushing incorrectly for so many years and not actually a valid technique. Airbrushing can take up a lot of space, and you may not know this, but my office is tiny, like seriously tiny, and storage is something that is always on my mind. That's why the Mix Rack modular paint storage got me so excited. The Mix Rack paint storage is a system that can hold almost anything you need. For my space, I chose 2 cub bundles that come with 4 paint racks each, as well as 2 frames with extra shelves and 2 wall racks. In total, my new setup will hold about 300 paints, as well as organize my current projects, basing and terrain pieces, and more. No matter your setup, Mix Rack probably has something to make your hobby space better. To learn more about the Mix Rack modular paint storage system, check out their GameFound page, linked in my description box. When it comes to detail work, remove the cap. Removing the cap helps you achieve smaller lines. It lets you see the needle for better aim and allows you to be closer to your subject. Just be careful with your gun with the cap off, as you're more likely to bend the needle working this way. My Harder and Steenbeck needle is actually doing quite well considering I've now dropped this air gun twice. The first time was I just dropped it. The second time was that I was unscrewing it from the air hose to switch to a different gun, and the air compressor was still on, causing the airbrush to shoot off the hose. So also, bonus tip, make sure you're holding your gun tightly before you remove it from the hose. If you're having problems with the paint drying on your needle, it could be that you are not using the trigger correctly. Now, unfortunately, this comes down to a bunch of other factors: PSI, the type of paint you're using, consistency of the paint, etc. But it is something that you can test for. You can avoid dry tip on your gun by releasing the trigger slowly, instead of just allowing the trigger to snap back after letting go of the air and paint. If you've ever noticed that on a second, third, whatever pass of your gun, you get a splattering of paint first, that's because that paint is drying on the tip and is being launched off the needle onto your subject. This is my biggest problem in airbrushing, and how I have traditionally solved it is just by starting the gun off to the side to release that splatter, and then moving it to my subject and beginning to blow paint then. But no matter what, pull your trigger back as far as you need, and then slowly allow that trigger to ease back into position, letting off of the air last. The best masking solution is Silly Putty. Previously, I recommended Blue Poster Tack or Liquid Mask, both of which are not that great, especially when Silly Putty is so inexpensive. The type of Silly Putty doesn't matter, mine happens to be iridescent. The main thing is that it spreads very easily and doesn't leave any sort of residue behind, nor pull paint up from your model. When in doubt, email the manufacturer. I've been having this extremely annoying problem with my new Harder and Steenbeck Infinity. Every time I take the gun apart and put it back together, air blows back up through the cup and I can't get any liquid to spray, causing at best annoying bubbles or at worst a paint explosion, which is understandably a nightmare. I am then left cleaning and reassembling my airbrush over and over until it finally all locks into place. I reached out to people on Instagram, and the number one reply was that I needed a new seal, which seemed very unlikely as I had literally just bought the airbrush, but I emailed the manufacturer just in case, and they got back to me within 24 hours with a solution, which was replacing the seal. If I hadn't gotten the same confirmation from the manufacturer, I probably would have just ignored it, not thinking that needing to replace a seal on a brand new airbrush was a realistic problem. But with the new seal, things are actually going a lot better, and I have fallen even further in love with this airbrush. Another bonus tip, if you are ever having problems with your gun, try spraying water before you put paint into the cup. There is nothing more frustrating than putting paint into the cup, realizing that there's a problem, dumping it out, taking the airbrush apart, cleaning it, whatever you have to do, putting it back together, then putting the paint back in the cup only to find that the problem still exists. So, do yourself a favor, just use water first to test out before you put your paint back into the airbrush. Practice is the most important thing you need to do to improve your airbrushing. There are several great and inexpensive ways you can practice your airbrush. Make a dot grid and connect several dots together. This helps you practice aim, PSI, and developing a steady hand. Practice coloring a coloring book from the dollar store. This will help with aim, trigger pull, PSI, and hand control. Remember that paint consistency, distance, PSI, and trigger pull all work together to get the perfect application. And if you feel overwhelmed, that's totally fine. That's where everyone starts out. If you feel like you have all your airbrush settings nailed down and just need help with aim, you can put the model on something very sturdy that is the correct height, and then use both hands on your airbrush. Using both hands will greatly steady your aim. Alright, that's it from me. If you like what I do, go support me on Patreon. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.